Boa noite a todos e a todas. É um enorme prazer tê-los aqui nessa conversa com o professor Francis Fukuyama sobre as relações entre direito e desenvolvimento, né? Eu gostaria, em primeiro lugar, de agradecer ao próprio professor Francis Fukuyama, que tem uma agenda extremamente apertada aqui no Brasil. Ele vem para uma conferência, mas colocou o desejo de ter algum tipo de diálogo com a academia. E nós ficamos muito contentes, com a ajuda da Patrícia Galvão, que ele tenha decidido que esse contato se daria aqui na Escola de Direito da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, que, como todos vocês sabem, é uma escola de direito peculiar, por diversos motivos, que eu não vou aqui reproduzir, mas, entre eles, por ser uma escola que tem uma clareza de missão bastante grande. E essa missão é de contribuir, por intermédio de uma renovação do ensino e da pesquisa do direito, para o processo de desenvolvimento político, social e econômico da sociedade brasileira. Ou seja, uma escola que tem uma relação com a discussão sobre ciências sociais, economia, política, muito forte, né? E essa relação é uma relação de renovação dessas engrenagens de contato entre o direito e o desenvolvimento, né? Então, nesse sentido, eu espero que nós sejamos, sim, um bom lugar para a sua discussão, na medida em que o paper que nos foi apresentado para essa noite ser um paper que está intimamente ligado com não só a discussão sobre rule of law e desenvolvimento, mas também com os outros temas que tangenciam essa discussão, como a democracia, como a questão da efetividade do governo, né? Como todos vocês conhecem, o professor Fukuyama é um dos intelectuais de maior impacto nas discussões sobre a questão do Estado, a questão da economia, nas últimas décadas. Eu não preciso aqui repassar, mas relembrar que ele foi o autor de O Fim da História, O Último Homem, de 92, que recolocou o debate sobre esquerda e direita de uma outra dimensão, mas ele vem escrevendo também muitos outros textos importantes nesses últimos anos. Eu não vou passar aqui toda a lista, né? Mas é um autor importantíssimo e o privilégio de dialogar com ele é nosso. Eu queria agradecer ao professor Fukuyama por isso, convidá-lo para fazer uso da palavra. Muito obrigado.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here at the FJV. I've been a reasonably frequent visitor to Brazil. I spoke at the FJV in Rio, I think on my first visit back in the early 1990s. But obviously, as someone who's very interested in democratic development, watching the evolution of the Brazilian political system over the last 20 years, for me, has been, an extremely interesting process. And so I'm really happy to have this opportunity. I want to thank this institution. I want to thank Patricia Ferrara for facilitating this visit. So I'm going to talk about a very specific topic, which is how to theorize, conceptualize, and possibly measure the quality of government. And I should say right at the outset, I am not a lawyer, and I'm not an economist. I am a political scientist. And so what I say will have implications, I think, for legal studies. But my view of this subject, I think, really cuts across a number of separate disciplines. If I could speak as a political scientist, one of the things that I find very peculiar in at least North American contemporary political science is the absence of study of the state. We study democracy a great deal. We study ethnic conflict and voting and legislatures, but we actually spend very little time looking at executive branches and the way that they function. In law schools, it's a little bit different because you do have a whole discipline of administrative law which really deals with this question. And as we'll see when I get into the discussion of bureaucratic autonomy, this is a territory that administrative lawyers, I think, are very familiar with. But I think that one of the most important political institutions with regard to development outcomes is really the quality of public administration in a state bureaucracy. I think that there's been a tremendous amount of research on this subject, a lot of it led by economists over the last 20 years that have indicated that that is the case. I want to say a couple of definitional things at the moment. There's been a substitution in English of the word governance for the word government over the last 20 years, which is, I think, the result of a number of different forces. So the World Bank, for example, does not really talk about government. It talks about governance, and it talks about good governance as being important to securing development outcomes in terms of economic growth, social goods and outcomes, and the like. And the word governance, I think, is a little bit problematic from my standpoint because it reflects, I think, initially an unwillingness to actually confront the state itself and the politics of the state. There was a period, I think, that began with Reagan and Thatcher where ideologically the high ground was held by people that believed that the state was the source of low growth and economic problems, and people did not want to talk about government or big government. And even when they wanted to talk about it in the context of an international institution like the World Bank, it was easier to use this new word, governance, instead of referring to the state itself. And in fact, over the last 20 years, there's been a big effort in the development community to bypass or substitute other organizations for the state. And so now if you use the word governance, it can refer to corporate governance in the private sector, it can refer to NGOs, to the nonprofit sector, it can refer to international organizations, all of which provide, in some respects, state-like services in terms of guiding communities and political bodies, but are not the state. And I think as an empirical fact, yes, it is true that governance in that sense is provided by a lot of non-state actors in the contemporary world. And in a place like Europe, if you don't look at the EU level, you really don't understand where the core of a lot of regulation is coming from. But I do also think that an old-fashioned emphasis on public administration and the quality and the ability and the capacity of states to actually deliver public services is still the core of many developmental outcomes. And unless we are able to focus our research and attention on improving the quality of existing public administrations, we're not going to get to the developmental outcomes that we want. I could give you lots of examples or cases where this is true. Privatization. Even if your goal is to cut back the size of the state, if you do not have an adequate administrative infrastructure to actually value and sell and protect the minority shareholder rights of a privatized enterprise, it's not going to work well. And we had, unfortunately, a huge amount of experience with this in Russia and Ukraine, and here in Latin America, things like the Telmex privatization, so forth. It was a matter of state capacity. Even if the state wants to get smaller, you still need state capacity in order to oversee that kind of a process. Public utilities, the effectiveness and efficiency with which they are run depends, very highly on the the capacity of state bureaucracies. If you go to even to the developed world, to contemporary Europe, and you ask, what was one of the original sources of the current Euro crisis that the EU is suffering from? A lot of it, frankly, has to do with the differing quality of public administration between, on the one hand, Scandinavia, Germany, the Netherlands, and then specifically Italy and Greece, in which you had the survival of a certain form of clientelistic politics in both of those countries that led to very outsized and extremely inefficient state sectors. So Greece, for more than a century, has had per capita on average about 7 to 8 times the number of civil servants that Britain has had, of much lower quality, and that had a lot to do with the fact, with their inability to manage sovereign debt when the opportunity arose as a result of their joining the euro. So I think there's just a lot of, there's too much evidence at this point that says that if we cannot improve the quality of states, their ability to deliver services, their ability to deliver basic public goods, you are not going to achieve fundamental development outcomes. And you can spend time looking at other non-state actors as substitutes, but I think that in a way avoids a very important question. So when I talk about governance, and when I use that term in the paper that was distributed and in this talk today, I want to just make clear I'm focusing on public administration on the state sector, and I'm actually focusing on the whole question of implementation. This is another tendency that in the United States has been very strong to downplay the importance of the administrative side in favor of public policy. I've been involved with public policy organizations my whole life and public policy schools. And I think that there has been this evolution away from the questions of implementation towards questions of public policy. Woodrow Wilson, former president of the United States and former president of of Princeton University, when he was a Princeton University professor back in the 1880s, wrote a very famous article called "What is Public Administration?", in which he distinguished between the political level that decides on policy and the administrative level that implements policy. And part of the reason that he wrote this was that at the time, American public administration at virtually all levels, federal, state, and especially local, was completely unprofessional and was thoroughly clientelistic. Every single appointee in the American federal government, virtually, was there as a result of political backing from probably some member of Congress or some political party. And there's no effort to create a Weberian merit-based bureaucracy. And part of, I think, his effort in focusing on the implementation side really had to do with raising the dignity and the status of those people that would actually implement public policy. And I must say, this is a problem that we in the United States have not solved yet. If you look at President Obama's 2 major legislative achievements, his Affordable Health Care Act and the Dodd-Frank Act that regulates the financial sector, both of these acts have been, I think, largely undermined in the implementation stage, because in our particular constitutional system, it's not enough just to pass legislation. You can continue the political fight into the implementation stage, and the opponents of these 2 pieces of legislation have actually been very successful in undermining that. So I think that what we need to do when we talk about the capacity of states is to focus on implementation, focus on the quality of things like civil services. And for the moment, it's not to say that public policy and the substantive ends that public policy is following are not important. But I think that if we want to, for example, be able to compare the quality of government across countries, we need to focus on that narrower implementation question. This is an issue that comes up very much when you change your focus from Europe and, let's say, Latin America to East Asia. Because in East Asia, you have had a number of highly administratively capable states that were not democracies. Japan in an early phase of its development, South Korea under military dictatorship, Taiwan under the Kuomintang, and contemporary China under the Chinese Communist Party, as well as Malaysia, Singapore, other countries with very, very imperfect democratic accountability, have nonetheless achieved remarkable development outcomes. And I would say that that is because they have had all of those countries that are in this Chinese cultural sphere are heirs to this very long Confucian tradition of centralized bureaucracy that has given them a tremendous advantage. And this is something that they had in the period before they encountered Western colonialism. So the colonialism disrupted those political systems, but one of the reasons that East Asia has seen the rise of so many high-performing developing countries is, unfortunately, and I say this unfortunately because I'm a big believer in the intrinsic value of democracy, but unfortunately I think that it was not democratic accountability that created those outcomes. It was the possession of an administratively capable state. And so, for example, if you compare contemporary China and India right now, I think you see, the source of the problem. India has been a very successful democracy since partition, since it was created in the late 1940s. Given its size and ethnic diversity, the fact that they could hold this country together as a democracy has been nothing short of remarkable. But if you look at infrastructure, if you look at basic meeting of human needs in terms of education, health outcomes, the eradication of extreme poverty, the Chinese dictatorship has produced much better results. And so another thing that I think we need to focus on is to be able to characterize the quality of the state, the quality of the administrative apparatus of the state, independently of whether that state is democratic or not. We can then pose an empirical question as to what is the relationship between a high-quality administrative state and democracy. Does democracy aid or weaken administrative capability? I would say that in the development community today, there is a kind of consensus that all good things go together, that more democracy is the solution for political corruption, for weak administrative capacity, and so forth. And there's a clear theory behind this that says citizens do not like bad outcomes. They don't like corrupt governments. So if there's enough transparency and information about the performance of governments, then citizens will band together and demand higher quality government. They'll basically throw the bums out that are stealing from the public purse. This is a theory, and I do not think that this is an empirically proven point. And again, I would point to some of these East Asian outcomes as throwing a little bit of doubt as to whether that, that tight union between democracy and high-quality administration actually exists. And in fact, if you look at the history of low-income democracies around the world, there's also a theoretical reason to think that they would actually produce bad administrative outcomes, because I think clientelism, for example, that is to say, the politically motivated placing of supporters in administrative bureaucracies is something that is almost universally characteristic of low-income countries that hold democratic elections, beginning with the United States, as I said, in the 19th century. And so I think unless we have measures of state quality that are separate from our measures of democratic accountability and the measures of, so rule of law is a little bit complicated because to some extent, rule of law under certain definitions of the rule of law actually corresponds with administrative capacity. This is what you might call rule by law. Can the government actually enact legislation and carry it out according to enacted statutes? But in another respect, I think, and in the more deeper respect, rule of law is actually a constraint on government. It's a set of rules that prevent executive branches from simply acting in a totally discretionary fashion. And in that respect, there's a tension, I think, between law and administrative capacity. So I'm simply making a kind of theoretical argument that we ought to separate the different components of a political system into the following. This actually comes from my last book, The Origins of Political Order, which actually was published last year by Rocco, so it's available in Portuguese. But this is the overall framework that I work with, that if you think about political development, you really have 6 dimensions of development. So you have economic growth, you have social mobilization, and then you have 3 categories of political institutions. So you have what I've been talking about for the last few minutes, the state, the administrative state. You have rule of law that can be seen as a series of rules that constrain the discretionary behavior of the state. And then you have democratic accountability. And the thing about this framework, and what I would argue theoretically, is, and then finally you have in the middle a separate dimension which has to do with ideas and legitimacy, because I think those evolve separately from those other dimensions. But what I would argue, and I believe this is a continuation of an argument made by my mentor, Samuel Huntington, back in the 1960s, is that every one of these dimensions of development can occur separately from the other dimensions. That you can have states that are administratively capable but don't have rule of law or accountability. That's China. You can have some that have a strong administrative capacity and rule of law but no accountability or little accountability. That's Singapore. You can have some that have elections but little rule of law and a very weak state. That's, Afghanistan. And what we need empirically, I think, as social scientists to figure out is instead of positing necessary connections between these different dimensions of development, we simply need to think empirically as to what we know about the existing causal relationships. So I'm going to focus on that first box in the political, in the political set of dimensions, and talk about how you measure state quality. Basically, I think there are a number of existing empirical measures that have become available. Everybody has gotten into the quantification of political outcomes over the past 15 years or so, beginning with the World Bank. So you're probably familiar with the World Bank's worldwide governance indicators. That's actually, technically, it doesn't come from the World Bank. It comes from the World Bank Institute, which is a research arm that is associated with the bank, but it actually doesn't represent the bank's official position. The bank itself uses something called the CPIA to rate the quality of government in its different client countries. So if you're aware of the worldwide governance indicators, they have 6 categories that they try to measure, including voice and accountability, rule of law, control of violence, regulatory quality, government effectiveness, and control of corruption. And these have been used quite a lot by a lot of social scientists because basically in certain of these, particularly when you get to measuring things like rule of law in the state, these are, the few measures that are out there and exist. But they're very, very problematic because, for one thing, they give a single number in each of these 6 categories to an entire country. So all of Brazil, all of China, all of South Africa gets 1 score, regardless of the fact that, the quality of government varies tremendously by the level of government, by the sector, whether it's health, education, security, public financial management, and the like. It obviously varies, down to an individual agency level. And so I think we need much more granular kinds of indicators to measure the quality of the state. There have been a lot of proposed ways of characterizing administrative capacity. So one of the common ones that my fellow political scientists use is tax extraction, the ability of a state to basically extract taxes out of its population. This, tells you something, because most extremely poor countries have very, very low tax extraction rates, 5 to 10% in many extremely poor countries, and most developed ones tax, 40, 50% of GDP. Again, there's a lot of problems with this as a measure. For example, there's a difference between the theoretical tax extractive capacity of a state and the actual extractive rate that's due to policy preferences. The United States in wartime taxed 50% of its GDP in order to pay for World War II, let's say. But right now it only taxes about 24% because for political reasons we don't like taxes, or we've got an important part of our political system that really doesn't like taxes. And so these reflect not administrative capacity so much as policy choices. Population registration. To what extent can a state actually identify who lives in its territory for purposes of redistricting, for purposes of providing universal education, in terms of voting or voter registration, and so forth. In Latin America, informality is a huge phenomenon, and a lot of that, as Hernando de Soto and other people have written, reflects the fact that many people are actually outside of the formal legal system, don't have clear property rights, and therefore are not able to receive state services, are not able to collateralize loans, are not able to litigate, to protect their property, to use the judicial system, and the like. So, it's another candidate. It's another candidate measure. Obviously, you can also measure outputs in terms of educational outcomes, health outcomes, and the like. This is also something that's used quite frequently. I think there's a lot of problems with using outcome measures because the public inputs to outcomes is actually, in many cases, very small. In education, for example, I think most education researchers have indicated or shown that only about 30% of the actual measured performance of a student body is due to the public inputs, and the rest has to do with family, friends, neighborhood, level of development, and the like. And then the final question has to do with this question of bureaucratic autonomy, the degree to which officials in a public bureaucracy are actually given the authority to make discretionary judgment calls in the exercise of their duty, or the extent to which they are bound by detailed rules that prescribe their behavior. And in this respect, I think there's a very odd discrepancy between the way that, and as I said, in administrative law, this is what's known as the whole problem of rules versus discretion. There's a very odd conundrum in the way that we think about this with regard to low-income countries. If you go to the World Bank or DFID or USAID or big, rich world development agencies, what we have been telling poor countries for the last generation is to reduce the amount of discretion in public procurement, in administrative activity in general, because our view under kind of the usual principal agent models that we use to characterize public bureaucracies is the whole problem is that the agents have too much discretion, that corruption is the result of the fact that the agent wants to line the pockets of his family, his bank account, rather than caring for what the public authority wants that agent to do. And therefore, if you want to minimize corruption, what you want to do is increase the number of rules to make it impossible for that agent to, basically make the wrong decisions. The reason that that's peculiar advice is that that's not the problem in most bureaucracies. Most bureaucracies, including most bureaucracies in my country, the United States, is that they have too damn many rules. Public procurement, in the United States, if the Department of Defense wants to buy a new airplane, it's subject to something called the Federal Acquisitions Regulations, which is about 6,000 pages of extremely detailed procurement rules. And everyone that has looked at this problem understands that wading through this vast body of regulation is what drives up the cost of big-ticket defense items, or why it is that the Defense Department, when it tries to procure a computer, pays twice as much as a commercial firm. We have too many rules. So how is it the case that what we're telling poor countries that are dealing with problems of corruption is that they need more rules, whereas we have too many rules in developed countries? And indeed, in some poor countries, you actually have that phenomenon as well. So anyone that's dealt in India with public procurement or with the Indian bureaucracy would say, yeah, the problem there is too many rules. There's too much red tape. Things are too inefficient. You cannot get government agents to make decisions and the like. So this is my framework for, oh, by the way, these are just some. So this is the paper that I distributed. It's available in a couple of different places that deals with this question of how do you think about the appropriate degree of bureaucratic autonomy. So in my view, if you think about what's the right degree of delegated discretion that ought to exist in an administrative hierarchy, you probably have an inverted U-shaped curve of this sort. So on the x-axis you have less autonomy, and on the right-hand side you have more autonomy. You don't want to be at either end of that axis. You don't want to be at the end that says, we're going to prescribe your behavior by too many detailed rules, but you also do not want to grant bureaucrats total autonomy in decision-making, because it's not just in a democratic political system. In any political system, the political principle is the one that makes the political decisions. They're the ones that really ought to be giving the instructions to the bureaucrats. But certainly in a democracy, the sovereign people acting through their elected representatives are the ones that set the rules. So no one's arguing that any bureaucrat should have complete autonomy. But there probably is an inflection point in this curve somewhere between those two extremes that represents an appropriate degree of delegation. And the question is, how do you locate where that point is? I would argue that if you change the curves a little bit and make the y-axis now government quality, you can draw different curves for different countries at different levels of capacity. So the topmost curve, capacity level 4, would be Germany or Sweden or some Scandinavian country that has a very high quality bureaucracy with a great deal of capacity. And under those circumstances, you would feel free to delegate relatively more autonomy or discretion to those bureaucratic agents than you would in a country that is at capacity level 1. That may be Nigeria, let's say, with a very poor quality bureaucracy, very high levels of corruption, and therefore the ideal degree of autonomy that you want is much, much lower. And in fact, if you draw another curve, or this upward sloping line actually represents the inflection points of a whole series of those capacity curves. So basically what you're saying is that with low capacity countries, or in a big country in a low capacity agency, you're going to want to prescribe those agents with a lot of rules, whereas as your capacity increases, you want to give them greater degrees of autonomy, and there's a kind of sweet spot at the top where you have extremely high capacity, and therefore you can delegate a large amount of autonomy. And this leads you then to think about countries and where different countries would fit into this matrix. Now, the reason that each one of these countries is represented by a circle or an ellipse rather than a single point is that every country consists of a lot of different bureaucracies, and they all have different levels of capacity, and therefore they have a lot of different levels of appropriately delegated autonomy. So in the United States, for example, the Federal Reserve, our central bank, is unbelievably autonomous. It's one of the most autonomous agencies among central banks, far more autonomous than, let's say, the European Central Bank. So since the financial crisis, on their own authority or on his own authority, Ben Bernanke has been buying mortgage bonds and making, decisions to bail out this company, but not this bank, but not that bank, and so forth, without any explicit democratic, legislative, political control. On the other hand, there are really annoying parts of the American government that are bound by a tremendous number of rules. So fortunately, getting a business license is not one of them, but in terms of other forms of registration, in terms of environmental, meeting, I live near San Francisco. They've been trying to build this extra on-ramp to one of the big bridges in the Bay Area, and it's taken 7 years trying to get through all of the environmental qualifications that you need to do a big infrastructure in a big American city these days. And so there are other areas in which you're excessively constrained by rules. So every country is actually, on this diagram, a circle, some of, where they've got some agencies with a high degree of capacity and others with low capacity, right? So I don't know. I just put Brazil kind of in the middle of this thing because it seems to me that Brazil has evolved. And this is one of the things that I've watched, in the years since I've been coming to this country. There are certain parts of the Brazilian government that are extremely high capacity. So the central bank, the finance ministry, the development bank, Petrobras, they're all staffed by high quality. I mean, I know that there's a degree of politicization, but again, you have to look at this as a dynamic process over time where the quality of these institutions, in these kinds of islands of bureaucratic quality have been expanding since the let's say since the debt crisis in the 1980s, whereas other parts of the Brazilian government are terrible, especially as you get down to local level in particular parts of the country and so forth. And so Brazil itself would represent, a big scatter plot of different capacities and therefore different degrees of, the appropriate level of delegated autonomy. And this then leads to something like this chart, which is the policy chart, which tells you where you want to move. Everybody should want more capacity. The trouble with building capacity is that it takes a lot of investment. It's basically education. You basically have to train civil servants. You have to give them qualifications. You have to subject them to kinds of rigorous, examinations and promotion criteria and so forth. And very few countries can do this rapidly. This is like a generation-long, effort. And as I take it, this foundation was established really to push Brazil up, that capacity ladder. And it's been very successful, but it's a very, very slow process. And so therefore, in the short run, that's not a policy decision that's really under immediate control. And by the way, that's why politicians don't do it, because the payoffs from that kind of investment in capacity are ones you're not going to see way past the time that politician is in office. And therefore, there's always going to be a bias to doing things that are shorter term. But you can move on the x-axis dimension towards either greater discretion or more rules, and I think that you can distinguish, which direction you're going to move by what level of capacity you're at. So Nigeria, a very low capacity country, needs more rules. There's too much corruption, and you can bound that corruption by having, for example, more detailed procurement rules. China is at a very much higher level of capacity than Nigeria, but it also needs more rules. Its officials have too much autonomy in terms of, land requisitions, in terms of the kinds of discretionary decisions they make in, various kinds of policy trade-offs and the like. I would say that for the most part, the United States needs fewer rules in many areas because we are, excessively bureaucratized. And this, I think, is the answer to this question, this puzzle that I posed, which is why is it that development agencies are recommending more rules to poor countries and fewer rules, well, they don't recommend to rich countries, but why is it that that exists at the same time that you have excessive legal constraints on many kinds of administrative decisions in rich countries? So just to conclude, I'm actually in the midst of I'm not basically one of these quantitative social scientists, but in this particular project, I do actually have something called the governance project at Stanford that's trying to develop some better quantitative indicators of state quality and capacity, including measures of state autonomy of the sort that I've just outlined. If any of you have any suggestions for how to go about doing this, they would be very helpful. We're actually going to start with China, because I think that our existing measures of the quality of the Chinese state are, we just don't know enough about that. So just as an empirical data gathering exercise, we're going to start with China, but we also want to do this with other large, complex countries. Brazil would be an obvious target, and there's been some interest in the Inter-American Development Bank at helping us work towards this goal. So if any of you have any comments or suggestions about how to actually implement something like this in this country, or the more general theoretical question, I'd be very eager to hear them. So thank you very much for your attention.
Vai passar o microfone para as pessoas que quiserem fazer perguntas, então.
Professor Fukuyama, congratulations for your excellent lecture and your theory about the autonomy and the capacity of state bureaucracy. I have two basic questions. My first question has to do with if your proposal may also be used to assess the judicial power performance. My second question is if the concept of state autonomy or the bureaucracy autonomy may be sustained in a situation where there is a growing trend in relation between bureaucracy and different social sectors.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so actually this is something I'd be very interested in hearing your opinion about. So I'm not, as I said, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me that this framework ought to work in the judicial branch as well, because there are many parts of the judiciary that are given degrees of autonomy, different degrees of autonomy. So judges have autonomy, prosecutors have autonomy. In the United States, prosecutors have a tremendous amount of discretion in bargaining, in plea bargaining, in bringing criminal charges against various defendants. And I suspect that there's probably a similar kind of trade-off between capacity and autonomy in making that decision as well. There are theoretical reasons, I think, why you'd want less autonomy, and more democratic control in certain, classes of cases. But in terms of the flexibility that different parts of the legal system have, and especially when judicial corruption is a very big problem, I would think that this framework would apply. But that's a question I would pose to the lawyers in this room, since, as I said, this is not my area. I'm sorry, the second part of your question was?
The autonomy of bureaucracy in relation to other kinds of social sectors.
Well, so I think that one of the interesting things that's going on in the world today is that the demand for quality government is increasing across the board. And that actually, if I can go back to this slide, economic growth produces social mobilization. as a country modernizes economically, you get new social groups springing up, particularly middle-class individuals who have very, very different kinds of political demands out of the political system. And so I think you've seen across the world, including here in Brazil, the rise of tremendous number of new social actors that are not content to do politics in the old way, and they want government to perform differently. And so I think that one of the most difficult issues is how do you make a state accountable to a very demanding public that's got lots of social actors out there without disabling its ability to make fundamental decisions? Because if you turn over decision-making ability to basically a group of unorganized NGOs, you're not going to get anywhere. I mean, you can't make decisions under those conditions. And so what modern governments need to do is to figure out how to reconcile the need for autonomous judgment in the state administration with the need to be responsive at very many levels to the social inputs from mobilized social groups in society. And I think that the appropriate model for this, I guess in my view, the degree to which you can make those connections a bit more informal and not embed them in hard law is a benefit, because you need bureaucracies that can respond, but you also need procedurally relatively efficient procedures that will actually get you to a decision. In my country, in the United States, our entire constitutional system is based on a large number of checks and balances whose purpose is to prevent actually bureaucracies from acting. And the reason we get such bad, I think, policy outcomes is precisely because we've mobilized now so many different political actors to be able to veto the ability of the government to do anything, that we've not passed a budget in like 3 or 4 years. I mean, we go around preaching to every developing country that they should have, medium-term expenditure frameworks and plan their budgets out 5 years in advance. And we've not been able to pass a budget, in the last 3 years. And so I think that this is kind of one of the critical issues in democratic governance, that how do you get public input that is responsive and flexible to rapidly changing social demands, and yet not have it, essentially freeze the decision-making capacity of the government to actually deliver services and decisions.
It's so interesting. I want to jump in. I'm Jedediah Cronky, a professor here at DIREITO GV. And as I say, very much appreciate the talk, because the very field that Woodrow Wilson helped establish in the United States of public administration very much doesn't exist, right? Degrees in public administration. There used to actually be programs in public administration, no longer exist. Several members of my family had those degrees and believed in civil service and such. But I wanted to push back on two sort of aspects on the comparative side. And you're right in that when I read your paper, the very first thing I thought of was, one, administrative law, right? And second, jurisprudential debates about rules and standards. And one of the really interesting things that I think would assist is that one of the areas that's been the most aggressive on the comparative level internationally has been comparative administrative law, right? And in that, and especially like Wilson himself and Frank Goodenow and many of the early theorists of the administrative state talked about the relationship of the judiciary, right? You can talk abstractly about rules and standards and how specific mandates are, but ultimately when it comes to the judicial review of this, right, that's a third factor that complicates things. And even in places like China and Singapore, they passed administrative litigation acts, right, to try to, and this has been a big growth in the field that's improved it, is you can even in authoritarian regimes, non-democratic regimes, have a theory of the relationship of the judiciary. So on one level, I think that's definitely an area where people are grappling with these empirical issues about what does autonomy actually mean. Like, there are people actively doing this, and I think integrating the judicial aspect would improve the theory. The more on the challenge side is, as an implication of this, people in this field have run up against the sort of incommensurability of certain values. Right? So if we look at the progression of your paper and we take out capacity as an avenue of reform and focus on calibrating autonomy, I think you're still going to see these sort of values as far as how people look at expertise, and this becomes a barrier. So, for example, the second you lay out these things about the United States, I hear in my head people saying, this is a, this isn't a bug, it's a feature, right? And I'm sure you've probably already heard those exact words, right? We don't value, going from the Jacksonian period on, right, expertise. We don't trust expertise, and so it should be this way. On the flip side, when you talk about China moving here, I can hear my Chinese friends saying, well, we value expertise, and you have to have a central administration that has very few rules. You can do whatever you want on the local level, because this allows the flexibility that allows us to have this macro scale. On the flip side, when you look at this in the context of scale, you also have other interesting comparative examples like Singapore, high trust of expertise, efficient, small country, and then you look at like Switzerland, again, small, efficient, but with a relatively less sort of favorable attitude towards expertise and local participation at a number, democratic inputs at a number of different policy and administrative levels. So in that sense, do you really think, like, who is ultimately your audience then for this? Like, in the sense that who's going to get beyond output measures, right? I see these debates and people say outputs are flawed, but ultimately, you put them out there, people make their decisions, and you're not going to be able to transcend arguments about outputs because of these incommensurable issues in the nature of expertise.
Okay, well, on the first point about the judicial element of it, I didn't get into it in this presentation, but you're right, that's a very important comparative dimension. And there I would say actually there's a similar kind of inverted U where you can have too much or too little. And so you're right, in China and other authoritarian countries, you do have some degree of low-level judicial review of kind of ordinary government decisions. You can't review, the standing committee of the Politburo and whether they're complying with the law, because they don't have to, but you're right that that's the case. On the other hand, I think in the United States, we use our judiciary for enforcement purposes in situations where many European parliamentary democracies would use an administrative hierarchy. And I think that that's a very inefficient way of doing things. So, this example of that, the new part of the Golden Gate Bridge, part of it is people litigating in court over the period of 6-7 years to stop the government from doing something or to force it from doing something, whereas in Europe this would simply have been run through a bureaucracy charged with building the bridge, and the bridge would have been built in a couple of years. On the question of how do we value expertise versus democratic control, yes, you're right that different countries with different political traditions line up differently in terms of that, but every country needs expertise. And I would say even in expert-hating America, if you look at public opinion polls about what parts of the government are the most respected, they are inevitably the most technocratic. The military, the Supreme Court, the FDA, even the Federal Reserve. Who is the least respected in the United States? It is the House of Representatives, the most democratically accountable part of the American government. So I think even Americans have this sense that pure democracy leads to a bunch of grandstanding politicians getting up and making really bad decisions, where if you had given this to more competent people to decide, we would have gotten better outcomes. So I think every country has to face this, it really has to face this need to balance expertise and democratic accountability.
Professor Fukuyama, I'm Isaac Coelho, a part-time professor in this school. I appreciate the rationalization that you make of linking development in the East Asia countries to the high quality of the public administration under the Middle Kingdom and so on. There is a slightly different vision on this put forward by Professor Kyung-Choo from Korea. He says that's not, he doesn't go into that kind of consideration, but he explains development both in the authoritarian period and in the democratic era as due to different social organizations, namely that the people who are of Confucian extraction, say, they are more collectivist in outlook, and they cooperate, and they don't try to beat the system as often as Western European cultures, which are much more, say, individualistic. So, do you consider this perhaps a competing explanation or complementary to what you are proposing, or how do you see it?
I think that it's largely complementary. So when you think about what makes for a really good, high-quality, autonomous bureaucracy, it is not the fact that the bureaucrats close themselves in a room and talk to each other and come up with a great decision and then announce it to the whole, to the rest of the society and then impose it on them. A high-quality bureaucracy consults with the people that are being ruled, and they take inputs from those people, and their decision-making is shaped by an iterative process between the bureaucracy and the civil society. There's a very interesting book that's just been published by Stein Ringen, who is a Norwegian, actually, who now teaches in the UK, actually about the growth of the South Korean state. And his argument is the reason that it was good, it was a high-quality authoritarian state, was precisely because it did not try to control civil society down to the last, organization, but actually took significant advice and co-opted many civil society organizations into its exercise of authority. So that's why I think, it's a complementary thing. I do think that there is an adversarial quality to democracy and litigation and other things that we do, especially in the United States, that probably makes that kind of a smoothly functioning, bureaucratic organization much harder, to achieve in other cultural settings. And so, in that respect, it may be an alternative explanation for why, those systems work well.
Professor Fukuyama, yeah, I was wondering while reading your paper, I would like to ask you about this normative descriptive relation in your paper. You say you're going to put all the normative questions aside and focus on the
implementation.
The descriptive point of view.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the normative doesn't come back when you talk about this relation between capacity and autonomy, because what seems to me is that you're trying to measure innovation. That's the normative point. And you're kind of changing from a legal form model of legitimation to a more charismatic or I don't know, a technical way of model of legitimation, and proposing a kind of heroic model for bureaucracy. When I write a paper, I think that your model of a good administration is kind of a heroes that are very capable and they can do things in a very uncertain environment. And we can ask this question about flexibility in a legal formal framework. But it seems to me you're just changing for a more charismatic or mode of legitimation.
Well, okay, I want to be very clear about what I said in that paper about wanting not to focus on the substantive ends of policy. Of course, these normative considerations pervade everything. You can't get rid of them. So even if what we're saying is we want fast, efficient government, that's a normative statement in itself, because maybe there are people that value slow, stupid government, I mean, it's possible that, such values exist. And this comes, to fore in this question of the concentration camp guard, because if you say that you just want to look at implementation and not the ends of policy, does that mean that a ruthlessly efficient concentration camp guard that kills his prisoners very quickly is better than one that can be bribed or is incompetent or so forth? And by my narrow definition of focusing on administration, you have to say, yes, the ruthless guard is the better guard. So obviously there are big problems in this. All I can say is we're always debating public policy. That's what we spend all of our time doing. But actual development outcomes in so many cases involve countries that do not have the simple administrative capacity to achieve an objective like primary school education that everybody agrees is a good thing. There's no disagreement normatively that we want to do this. There's a case that Jean Drèze wrote about in India where they did a study that showed that in some poor northern Indian states, 50% of school teachers were not showing up in their classrooms, 50%. So there's this big outcry, political outcry. This happened in the late 1990s. 10 years later, they go back and they find that despite all of these reform efforts, the number was still like 47% of teachers weren't showing up, right? And so that just seems to me to indicate that that you don't have to argue about the ends of policy. I mean, everybody agrees that teachers ought to go to school and teach their children, and you've got a state that cannot provide that basic service, and you got to fix that somehow. So that's all I'm saying is I think if we're interested in development outcomes, you really do have to focus on this narrower issue of implementation of policies that everybody accepts are desirable.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is José Reinaldo, and I teach law here at the school. Mine is a curiosity. You said you were beginning your project with China, so I was just wondering what sectors of Chinese bureaucracy have you given priority, and how do you justify the priority they have been given in our research?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a question that has yet to be determined. One of the things I want to do is actually try to come up with these measures across all of the sectors, because they obviously differ tremendously in terms of quality. So I would say that if you look at macroeconomic policy management in China, they've been amazing over the last 30 years, better than the United States, better than people running the EU in many respects. If you look at food safety, it's terrible. It's just awful. If you look at environmental protection, it's awful. If you look at local governments, grabbing land from peasants without adequate compensation, it's awful, right? So that's why I think that we don't have any good, real empirical handle. And I'm making these generalizations on the basis of anecdotal evidence. And all I'm trying to do in this project is come up with a more, evidence-based, empirical way of assessing. If you look across all sectors of Chinese government, what does it look like? What is the actual quality? And just as in the case of Brazil or India or any other large complex country, there's not a single answer to that, because the quality varies tremendously from one, part of the government to another.
Professor, just a minute. We have about 15, 20 minutes, not more than that. So I would suggest if we could collect some questions, and then you could answer them, okay? Please.
Yes. Okay. Oscar Vieira from FGV. Yes, I understand your effort to create distinctions between the concepts. So one thing is democracy, another thing is governance, another thing is rule of law. And this is indispensable to make good analysis and perhaps to focus on how these things interact with each other. So distinctions is fantastic. And obviously, when we see several of the problems of developing countries, you understand the notion or the importance to understand the efficiency of governance. You know, you gave all the examples of, you know, having good schooling, having good policing, have a good education or whatever. So, but my point is when you add the notion of good governance to governance. Because, you know, if someone asked me to define a knife, I would say something that cuts with a blade. What is a good knife? I said, well, something that cuts very well without human effort. So it's a good definition of a knife, and is a good definition of a good knife. And when you define governance, you say, well, something that implements. But when you ask what is a good governance, perhaps it is impossible to have a good definition without a normative perspective. Let me take the rule of law debate. If you say, what is rule of law? It's a very close definition of your definition of governance. But when you say what is a good rule of law, it is indispensable to say, well, when you implement the law in an impartial way, if you implement the law in a very egalitarian way. So it is really possible to define governance and good governance without the notion of a normative notion, even of impartiality, equality, control, democracy. Because you gave examples. The central bank, you know, it's fantastic, because they don't have to be controlled by democracy. But perhaps they are very, you know, on the timeline, it's a specific example. But if you take a longer timeline, you would be impossible to find an organization that functions without democratic control that is a good governance. I'm sorry.
Okay. Okay, sure.
Professor, thank you very much for your talk and for your paper. It seems to me that you are assuming an unidirectional relationship between the institutions and development, in which that good institutions leads to a good economic development, a good result in economic development. In particular case of this paper, good governance will lead countries to good standards in economic development. But there are some scholars that claim just the opposite, that this relationship goes the other way around, from economic development to high standard institutions. And in this case, if these scholars are correct, my question is curbing discretion, which is your point for the non-good countries, curbing discretion to Nigeria or Brazil or some others might only hinder the necessary discretion and development policies required to these countries to sponsor their economic development, and consequently their institutions. Because basically development policies presuppose or assume some degree of discretion. That's the story of South Korea or China. China, for instance, handle its economic relation through the information ties. The name is, I don't know the correct pronunciation, but something like Guanxi, the name of this very informal ties. But the Guanxi enabled China to achieve a very good economic development, consequently open the space to reform their institutions. So how much this discretion curbing could be a kind of backfire?
Okay.
Hi, Professor Fukuyama. Well, I'm Ronaldo Macedo, also a law professor here. Well, my question has to do also with this connection between democracy and and this good governance. In your paper, you make a quotation from Judith Tendler's book, Good Government in the Tropics. And it seems that, as far as I remember, one of the very concepts of good government, one of the meanings she gives for this concept, is the idea that it produces a lot of externalities towards social justice. So she doesn't really analyze how those policies implemented by Tasso Gereissati achieved the goals that were supposed to be achieved by the policy itself. But she also analyzed how this could create some kind of synergy between states and local agents, and for example, the local agents in the health program, etc. So my question is also connected with how to connect this with the value of democratic, and the second question also connected with this one is, what's your criticism, or what's your idea about the idea of this democratic experimentalism that has been developed by Charles Sable and Danny Roderick and many others, who try, it seems that in a different track, different than yours, this idea of how to connect development and democracy.
Okay. Okay. So for the first question, again, about we're back to this question of whether you can eliminate the normative dimension. And again, I would repeat, I'm not trying to eliminate it. I'm just trying to focus on a narrower question. So if you look at this curve, I'm not saying that bureaucrats ought to be given lots of discretion because they're experts and they know what's best. Any bureaucracy has to be under democratic control, including these independent central banks. So the Federal Reserve is still democratically accountable. Congress could abolish the bank tomorrow. We're going to nominate a new Fed chairman, and there's going to be a democratic debate over whether Janet Yellen is the right, president for the bank. But having made that basic democratic decision, at that point we delegate a tremendous amount of power to someone that has a lot of capacity and expertise. So you're right that I actually don't like the word good governance just because I think it mixes up too much the normative and the implementation parts. That's why I actually was focusing more on just things like capacity and autonomy as measures of government quality. And then you can raise the question, is it being used for good purposes or bad purposes? You can use both capacity and autonomy for really bad purposes, like the German and Japanese militaries in the 20th century were both they had a huge amount of capacity and they were very, very autonomous, and they got those countries into really big wars that were disastrous, right? So all I'm making is a plea that we just need to be able to measure that degree of capacity and autonomy, and we're going to argue about the ends of policy nonetheless. On the question of institutions and development, I do not mean to say that you've got to have really high quality institutions before you can develop. Empirically, that's nonsense. Britain, the United States, as I said, it had a very, very clientelistic, low quality bureaucracy in the late 19th century, in this period when it was industrializing and growing economically and educating children and doing all these other things. And so there's obviously a two-way causal relationship between institutions and development. For one thing, you cannot have high-quality institutions without having a resource base. So the United States today spends about $17,000 per capita on government services for every man, woman, and child in the United States. Afghanistan, with its own resources, spends about $20. So what can you buy with $20 per person? Nothing. So you don't get good quality governance. So obviously, economic development aids institutional development, and institutional development aids economic outcomes. So it works in both directions. Whether curbing discretion might actually hinder outcomes, yes, that's possible, but I still think that relationship with capacity is what makes the difference. So in East Asia, for example, you had highly discretionary planning ministries that were able to guide macroeconomic policy with relatively little interference from political actors, and that was extremely important. That's why they could have an industrial policy and run it fairly successfully. But those planning ministries were full of PhD economists. They were really, and that's where I think these cultural traditions matter, because there's just such an emphasis on high quality bureaucratic government that compared to other parts of the world. Whereas I'm sure that you could locate a lot of bureaucracies in this part of the world that you would not want to grant similar autonomy to, because they just, they'd make a mess of it. So I still think the framework works. I don't think that Judith Tendler or Chuck Sable or Danny Roderick, any of these people are necessarily saying anything different than what I'm saying. The emphasis may be a little bit different. You need democratic input and you need democratic control over public institutions. There's no question about that. But the form that public control takes matters a lot. The worst form it can take is when democratic politicians staff the bureaucracy with their own supporters. That's what we call patronage or clientelism. But in the United States, we don't have that. We have members of Congress, writing tax exemptions for important interest groups and, interfering in the implementation of laws. And that's another form of democratic control that I think leads to very poor outcomes. And so what you need is a better balancing of bureaucratic efficiency with the need to take public input. So, so I think that's the goal that we're all aiming for, is a more efficient way of making government responsive to democratic demands for what the public wants, but doing it in a way that doesn't procedurally tie you up to such a degree that you just can't make a decision. And that's where I think a lot of public agencies in many democratic countries are. That's India's problem. India cannot do a big public infrastructure project. Municipal water, electricity, airports, they just can't make the decision because their system gives all these democratic stakeholders, civil society, organizations, they all have a veto over what goes on, and so they don't make any decision at all. And that's why, I think they're being left behind by China, which is at the other extreme. I mean, they're way too decisive in not caring about citizen rights. But in that respect, the Indian solution is not a good one.
Hi, Professor. My first question goes in a way that you quoted in your article about surveys. I want to know
expert surveys.
Expert surveys.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What kind? I want to know. You talk. I want you to talk a little bit more about this.
What's wrong with them?
No. I want you to talk. I don't understand when you say expert surveys. There's so many types of surveys and there's so many types of control and I want you to know specifically what kind of survey you.
So there's a lot of expert surveys to measure things that are not visible on the outside. So Freedom House, for example, has these measures of both democracy and civil rights, and what they do is they go around every year to a group of experts on a particular country and they say, relative to last year, has the number gone up or down or changed? What is it? What does Burma look like this year compared to last year? What does it look like compared to Thailand? And the experts sit around and they say, well, it was a 4 last year, but now it's a 4.5, and and so forth. And a lot of the World Bank numbers are based on an aggregation of this kind of expert survey. And I'll tell you an exact way in which they're misleading. So Matt Andrews, who teaches public administration at the Kennedy School, has just written a new book. He follows the worldwide governance indicator measure of government quality in Argentina, for example. And it turns out that the measure goes up and it goes down and goes up and it goes down, but it always regresses to the same mean based on these expert opinions. And it turns out that what the experts are responding to is the Argentine government's announcement that they're going to do some policy or institutional reform. And the experts know about that, and so they say, oh yeah, Argentina's getting better, but then the reform has no impact on actual outcomes whatsoever, but this does not become apparent until several years later, and then the experts then realize, well, actually nothing's happened in Argentina, so it goes back down again. And that just seems to me an example that the experts actually don't know what, all they know is what they read in the newspapers, and something seems to be happening, but they have no idea whether this is actually producing better government or not. And so that's one of the reasons why what I would like to do is have an actual measure of what's actually going on inside the government rather than just what a bunch of outside experts think about what's going on inside the government.
Okay, we have to finish, so just your question and then we have to stop, okay?
Professor, my name is Gustavo. I am a graduate student of political science at the University of São Paulo. First, I would like to ask you, can we come back to the graphic where you show Brazil position? Yeah, exactly this one. Brazil, it's almost in the middle of the intersection, yeah? I'd like to ask you, how do you see the relation between economic growth and social mobilization in Brazil? And where do you think we are going? This relation is taking us in this graphic.
Yeah. Well, so the social mobilization in Brazil has created this new middle class that is much larger than it was, 10, 15 years ago. I think a lot of the social protest that you've seen in this country is based on that new mobilization, which is the outcome of economic, just economic growth, and is placing much greater demands on government. Now, whether that actually produces higher quality government is a really, that's the really big question. As I said, the reigning orthodoxy among many development specialists is, yes, public demand for better quality government should lead to higher quality government, but there's a lot of steps that have to occur before that happens. So one thing about social protest, that was true in the Arab Spring, it was true in Ukraine and the Orange Revolution, a lot of different places, is you get a bunch of young protesters together, they can bring down a government or they can, call attention to their issue, but then there's no follow-through in terms of a long-term mobilization to, let's say, create a new political party or to really use the political system to force the government to actually make a meaningful long-term institutional change. And that could happen, here as well. People that are mobilized may not understand, the right agenda in terms of what needs to be done. So there's a lot of things that have to happen before you translate social mobilization into higher quality government. It's not automatic. It goes through a very complex political process. And that's, I think, where the focus really needs to be. All right?
Bom, eu vou cometer a indelicadeza de falar um pouquinho em inglês, porque assim eu consigo agradecê-lo corretamente com o resto do público. So, thank you very much. It was a very enjoyable talk, a very thoughtful talk, a very provocative talk. But most of all, for us, I think it is very coherent with what we are doing here, not in terms of exactly ideas that we share, but the parallel process of lawyers trying to understand the relationship between development and law. And I was talking with my colleague Mario that organized a seminar, a month ago, which is a seminar that brings together the best paper of each of us on the theme every year. And one of the conclusions in the end is that if there is one idea that should be taken more seriously by us in understanding this relationship, is the idea of discretion. So in some ways, it reproduces the same idea. What kind of autonomy I will give, what kind of rigorous, strict application of law we are giving. And discretion is what is different in the country that tries to mobilize its legal system to provide development. So I think it's a good convergence in terms of ideas, and I thank you very much to share your ideas with us. Thank you. Thank you.